Grandma here. Today I'm going to show you a game that we've made called Hungry Square. It's really quite fun to play, but it's relatively simple programming wise, so it's a good game that I wouldn't say for complete beginners, but if you know just a little bit of MakeCode Arcade, then this would be a good game to study and use. It does show several very interesting characteristics of MakeCode Arcade games. First, let's look at how we play it. There's a square that moves up and down. The food streams are launched from the right, and the idea is to get us, and they're launched randomly in 3 streams, and they come at different intervals. So the idea is to eat as many squares as you can for the square to eat as many foods as you can in 1 minute. Okay. I've gotten as high as 70. And maybe my old grandma responses are pretty slow. After just a couple of plays, my granddaughter way outdid me. Well, okay, let's see. We have 3 seconds left. Okay, that's how the game ends. Now note the score is 55, and notice that the score is expressed as a percentage of foods eaten relative to the number of foods launched. So no matter how many foods get launched during the game, the score is relative. The scores are comparable game to game because it's a percentage. Since the foods are randomly launched, there might be more foods in one game than in the next, so it wouldn't be fair to just count the foods. Okay, let's look at some code. Okay, where's the code? There it is. We're gonna make the screen all code. Okay, this is most of the code, and then there's a little bit more down here, which I will explain. I like to lay the code out this way so I can see it all at once. And the way I lay out my code is on this side, the left side of the screen, I put the first code that's going to run. That's the on start. Then I put the game loop, and in this case the game has 2 loops, and they update every so many milliseconds, and that is a random number. So the top one changes the stream randomly from top, middle, bottom. The lower one launches food at various intervals. Then moving on, and then how do you stop the game? Once you have a game loop, you have to figure out how to stop the game. So you stop the game. In this case, we set a game countdown to 60 seconds. So when 60 seconds have elapsed, this event will trigger and the game will stop. So then you have to look at, well, how does the user interact with the game? Well, moving on over here, that's these 2 events. First is if the up button is pressed, then this happens, and if the down button is pressed, this happens. Well, obviously when the up is pressed, the square is moved up 1 level vertically, and when the down is pressed, it moves down vertically. And that should position the square so that it will intersect foods. Well, that's what this is all about. This actually keeps score. So it says when the player, which is the square, intersects the food, then this happens. So we change the number of foods eaten by 1. We set the score to the percentage of foods launched, which was kept track of down here. And when we launch a food, we increment that by 1. Then we make a sprite and attach it to the square as a percentage, which seems kind of redundant with the fact the score is kept up in the right, but I wanted to emphasize that the score is a percentage, so that's how I did it. And of course you want to destroy the food when it's been intersected with the square, in other words, eaten. And I like to play a tone. Well, the tone played depends on what level the food is on. So it's a higher note if it's a top level, then there's middle C, and then the lower if it's on the bottom level. So and then I set the square to this is the closed mouth version of the square. I'll show you that in a minute. So that means it chomps down on the food. Then you pause a very short time, and then you open the mouth again. So that is the main game loop. Over here we initialize things, then we have the game loop that runs indefinitely. Both of these do at random times. Then that's how we, when the countdown reaches 0, that's how the game ends. Then we have what the user does, up and down arrows, and then we have what happens when the square intersects a food. Now, let's look a little more closely at a couple of these. The onStart, first of all, we have this Boolean variable called bgo. And the reason for that is in various versions of this in testing, some of these game updates ran before the onStart had can be completed. We wouldn't want that to happen. So we just set bgo to false when we start up, and then we set it to true when we are finished. And over in these game updates, we check to be sure we're in a go mode. So if it happens that one of these updates run before we're finished and onStart, then it will just exit without doing anything. So the first thing we do in onStart is we draw the square. We create the square sprite. And I'll show you that in a minute. Well, I'll just show you that now. Okay, here's the create square. So we have two images. We have a first image and the second image. That's the open and the closed. Then we set the square to be a player, and we put it in the open mode. And then we position the square. This is at the center. X always stays the same, but Y changes depending on whether the square is at the top, middle, or the bottom. So then we create the square. Then we call initialize the notes list. Well, that's pretty simple. The notes list are just these 3 C notes. That one's middle C. And then we calculate this variable, the number of the n of the last note. So that's the length of the notes list. In fact, that's an error. Oh my goodness. Of course, I never accessed the last one, but it really should be -1, because if the number of the first note is 0, that's the index, 0, 1, 2. So the length of the note list is actually 3, so there is no notes list index 3. There's only 0, 1, and 2. So in order to get the number n of the last note, you have to always subtract 1. Well, rather than do this every place I might need it, when I create an array, or a list, I usually just create a variable which is calculated as the last member. Thank you for helping me find that mistake. Gee, I didn't know I ever made mistakes. That is the first one I've made in the last few seconds. Okay, then the next thing we do is call initialize the foods images, and that is indeed what is being done here, same as with the notes. Now, and then we calculate the last food image number index. An interesting thing is, as I understand the array definitions, there's an array of sprites, but there's no array of images. So if you go here to look where you define arrays, Well, there's numbers, there's text or characters, and then here is sprites. Well, I don't see images. Well, but it turns out an image, it just apparently has a number assigned to it. So if I create a list of numbers, I can actually assign images to it. Hope they don't change that, even though it's undocumented. So I have an array of images. These are images, not sprites. Okay, and it does seem to work, so I'm happy. Then we set the number of foods launched to 0. We set the number of foods eaten to 0. We set the food Y at 60 because that's where the food, I call them food streams that move from right to left, and the Y changes to different levels. Then we call set this music note, which just sets the note depending on what the Y is. So there's how that is done. The note then we set the score to 0, the countdown to 60 seconds, which will go off. This will fire when that goes off. We set the volume to 255. I found on some devices, like the Meow Bit, well, I found only on the Meow Bit, that the sound volume for some reason is just really, really low. By setting it to high, it works better. And then on my computer, if I'm playing on my computer, I can lower the volume of the computer easily. Okay, that is the entire game. So we'll just leave you with a little bit of gameplay, and I like to look at it sometimes in the big screen mode. Ooh, that's so fun. Notice there is some strategy, because sometimes it's really, there's not enough foods coming in a stream to justify moving, because it takes a little time to move the square. And as they're coming, if you see 2 streams, you need to pick the longest one. I'm doing pretty good this time. Okay. Bye till next time. This is Grandma out.